Amen. Hey, we're still in Matthew chapter 1. Can you believe it? We're at least at verse 17, kind of, as we get through here. And here's what, of course, the genealogy of Jesus. We're looking through this. And here's what Matthew has for us today. And thus there were 14 generations from Abraham to David. We've looked at that time period. And then 14 from David to the exile. We looked at that time period, the kings. And now it is from the exile to the Messiah. And we're in this period right now from the time they were in exile in what was Babylon, and then it was overtaken by Persia, we're going to see. And then they finally get to go back to their homeland, Israel. And then, of course, Jesus comes through this. Now, the genealogy of Jesus is all about Jesus. We have to remember this. It's all about Jesus. It's always all about Jesus. 42 generations, 3 distinct periods of Israel's history. And this whole genealogy leads us to that final concluding point of Jesus being born. And really, it leads us to Easter. And that's where we're going. Jesus' birth, his life, his death, his resurrection. And last week we saw from Jeremiah chapter 29 as he was writing to these exiles in Babylon. And we saw that even in these dark times, these wilderness times, the times of pain, the times of struggle, the times of hardship, God is not only present, but calling us to hope and a future in the midst of it. And that's an amazing thing that God has for us. The amazing thing. And that hope and future and new life always begin, I think, in those dark wilderness times. And I would just notice that in the last couple of weeks I was out, walking the dog, whatever it was, going through the yard, and I'm like, it's cold, it's rainy, it's overcast, it's not nice. And I would say that's a typical spring day here in Michiana, but we had a beautiful day yesterday, so I probably shouldn't say that. It was beautiful. And in all those times, even with snow and frost, I've got tulips coming up that are, so tall. And all these things in the midst of this horrible, dark time, they're growing. And I think that's just perfect. That's how God works with us. You see, they don't wait until it's warm and sunny before they start to grow. They're growing in those dark times. They're growing in those cold times, those overcast times, so that when it is warm and sunny, they are able to bloom. And I think that's what God has for us, okay? Be thinking about that as we move through this time. Where is God at in our lives, and where is God leading us to the things that God has us to do within our lives? So, just to get caught up with history stuff, okay? Remember, all this that we talk about in the Bible is not just like in a vacuum somewhere. This is real history of the world taking place, and we're involved in it. See, Israel has broken the covenant they made with God. They've been unfaithful. They've rejected God. They've looked to and worshiped a bunch of worthless idols and false gods made of wood and stone. And God says, you've completely missed your purpose. I revealed all that I am to you for one purpose, that you might be a light unto the world, a light unto the nations, so that all might know me and know who I am. See, God's whole purpose is that God wants the world to know He is the one true God. He is the one who holds salvation. Everyone needs to know me. This was your job, and they didn't do it. In fact, they rejected God, and they looked for all these false idols and gods, and it caused a big problem. Now, we know that from about 605 BCE to about 586 BCE, in Judah, in Jerusalem, 3 different times there were exiles taken from there and brought over to Babylon, which is kind of modern-day Iraq and in that area, okay? But in 586 BCE, they finally are tired of all the times of Jerusalem and the kings they put in place. They keep rebellions. They say, that's it. And they wipe out the city walls. They wipe out the city. They wipe out the temple. Everything is brought down. But as God had promised years and years earlier, in 539 BCE, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquers Babylon. He conquers Babylon, and we see in the middle this city called Susa. That's where we're going to be today, okay, in the story we're going to talk about. So Babylon takes over. They are now the world power, and in 538 BCE, Cyrus makes a decree that the Jewish exiles have permission to return to Israel. Just like God promised, He said, I've got plans for you, plans for hopes and a future. This is going to happen, and it's going to take place. It's like Ezra, he writes about this. Thus says the king, Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord, the great God, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has appointed me to build Him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And He says, it's time you can go back there. And we find out that about 50,000 Jewish people go back to Israel at this time. And they're under the leadership of a man by the name of Zerubbabel, and also of a priest named Joshua. And if you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 13, you'll see in Jesus' lineage is a man by the name of Zerubbabel. Guess what? Isn't that interesting? You see, there's this timeline. God's got a purpose. He's moving things to a certain spot, to a conclusion, and it's going to happen in Jesus. Now, during the next few years, they begin to rebuild the altar. They have sacrifices. They lay the foundation and begin to rebuild the temple itself. But there were a number of people still left in that land. And they began to oppose this building and the things that they were doing. So everything got real stagnant. About 20 years later, 520 BCE, Darius becomes king, and he gives the order to build the temple, and the temple is built. And this all happens under, in this history, remember, this is all history, under the leading of Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets. So the last three books of history in the Old Testament, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the last three prophets that are talking to these people, okay? This is after the time of the kings. This is when they are in exile and they're coming back. I was trying to keep it all straight for you. So meanwhile, all things are going decent there over in Jerusalem and Judah. Something's happening over many miles away. And meanwhile, back in Persia, some interesting things are happening, and an interesting scenario plays out. Remember, God's promise last week through Jeremiah was this: I've got plans for you, for hope and a future. I know you're not going to like it, because the reality is you're going to be stuck here in exile. In fact, all the people that were there, he's saying, you're not making it home. But you're going to have to live and thrive, because I've got plans for you, hope and a future right here, even in exile, and hope and for a future as we go back to Israel as well. And so we find the story of a woman by the name of Esther. Esther is an amazing story. A number of chapters to tell this whole story, and I don't believe they ever mention the word and the name God in the entire book. It's interesting. But it's amazing how God's fingerprints are happening and leading this thing through. Now, here we are. We're back in Persia, and King Xerxes is the king who's there, and he has this huge banquet to show off just how great everything is. So 180-day banquet he puts out. That's a long one, right? 180 days they celebrate, and he says, look at the majesty of the kingdom and all the wealth that we have. And the concluding day, the very day it was going to end, he says, I'm going to bring out my queen, and I'm going to show her off because she's so beautiful. And they get to the last day, and the queen refuses to come out and be seen. That's not good for her. So what does he do? Everybody sits down. They say, we need to find you a different queen. And he says, okay, all the maidens of the land, all these young women, you're going to come see if you're going to be the next queen. And they come from everywhere. Well, it just happens that there's a family there. They're from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, and this man's name is Mordecai. Now, Mordecai has taken in his younger cousin because her family has all died, and he's taken her in, and she lives with him, and her name is, you guessed it, Esther. And guess what? He sends her off. Now, as the story goes through, he's seen different ladies, coming through each night. A different lady would come in to see, is this the one to be the queen? No, he's not really finding anybody. Esther comes in. And now let me tell you, in chapter 2, this is what it says of Esther. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Favor. So she goes before the king, and now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she had won his favor and approval more than all the others, so he set the crown upon her head and made her queen. Can you imagine that amazing story? I mean, just right there is pretty amazing. But here's what I want you to get out of this. Do you ever think about favor in this world? What does it mean to have favor? To have acceptance, to be a connection where people like you and want to help you and benefit you, that you have this favor where you're nice, you're respectful, you're loving, you're pleasant. We should be praying for favor in our lives with different people. Do you ever do that in your life, to pray for favor? It's an amazing thing, and I'll tell you the story. I'll try and get through it quickly. Kathy, we hadn't been married very long, and she had switched jobs. She took this new job on, and the manager, the boss there, she was a woman who'd gone through a lot of hardships and things, and it was just a hard thing, and she was kind of bitter and angry, okay? And so, as it turns out, she took it out on everybody. So she was a woman who would be there at work. She'd rah, 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 and barking over here, and blankety blank blank to you, and she was just not very nice. And so Kathy and I decided one night, we said, we're going to pray for favor with her. So for a couple of weeks, that's all we did. We just would pray for favor. Give us favor. Give Kathy favor with her boss. And I mean to tell you the dramatic change that took place. She would be at work, and it would be like, rah, 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 blankety blank blank blank. And she would see Kathy, and her whole demeanor would change, and she'd be like, hi, Kathy. How you doing? What's going on? And it was like a completely different person. Kathy would leave, and it'd be back to, rah, 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 and again, favor. I believe God gives us favor. When you have favor, amazing things can happen. That's what happens here with Esther. She finds favor. She's a happy, nice, loving person and finds favor. Now, as it turns out, Mordecai, he's a person who stays at the king's, I guess you would say, the gates there by the palace, okay? And one day as he was there, he overhears two people talking. The two people talking, they're officials there, and they say, we're going to assassinate King Xerxes. We don't like him. We're going to get rid of him, take him down. And they hear it. He immediately goes to Esther and goes, Esther, you've got to go tell the king. She goes and tells the king, they want to kill you. Here's the two people. And she says, Mordecai is the one who did this. Gives him full credit for it. They check it out, and guess what? The two conspirators are found that they were trying to kill him. It wasn't good for them, okay? It was done. But Mordecai saved the king's life. Now, at the same time, the king Xerxes has elevated this one person named Haman. And he's given him all this honor in the kingdom. He's like second in the whole kingdom. And so as he even walks through the gates, everyone bows down before him. Everybody but, guess who? Mordecai. Now, why is Mordecai over in Babylon, which is now Persia? Because Israel couldn't stay worshiping God and focus on God. What did they have to do? We have to bow down and worship all these false idols. He says, no way, no how am I going to start bowing down and worshiping anybody else, God alone. Well, Haman doesn't like this one bit. So he has a real hatred for him. Not only does he have a hatred for him, he finds out he's a Jew, and he says, I want to take all the Jews out if this is how they are. Let me tell you another little story with this one. Just a handful of years earlier, there was a young man taken from Jerusalem, and his name was Daniel. Anybody heard of Daniel the prophet? He was brought over there to Babylon, and some people came with him, some young men that he knew and hung out with him, and their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Interesting names. But what happens with them is they are there, and King Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to build this mighty big tower, this altar, and when I play music, everybody's going to fall down, they're going to bow down, they're going to worship. It's all about me and how great I am, okay? And so that's what he does. He says anybody who doesn't do it, they get thrown in the fiery furnace and they're dying. They're dead. So they play the music, and everybody in the land falls down except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, why are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over there in Babylon? Because Israel was falling down and worshiping false gods, and they said, never again will we do that. We will not take part of that. We don't care what it costs us. So Nebuchadnezzar calls them forward. He says, don't you know you're going to get thrown in a fiery furnace? You think your God can save you? I love their answer. Oh, dear King, our God is very able to save us. But even if he does not, everybody get that part? Even if he does not, we will not bow down and worship that false idol. Whoa. He is so mad, he stokes up the furnace so hot that when they throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, literally it burns up the people throwing them in. Nebuchadnezzar jumps up and he says, wait a minute. He looks in the fire. He says, did we not throw 3 people in there? I say, yeah, we said there were 3. He says, how come I see 4? And one of them looks like the son of the gods walking with them in there. So he walks up there, he calls them out, and they come out, and listen to the story. I love this part. As they came out, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was there a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel to rescue his servants. They trusted in him. They defied the king's command. They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve and worship any other god. Therefore, I decree to the people, you need to pay attention to this God, the God of them." You see, they were willing to give up their life to do what was right. Mordecai, the same thing right here. He's willing to give up his life to make this thing happen. Sometimes folks, that was favor with God. Sometimes folks, we've got to do the right thing, even though the crowd's not doing it with us, even though it's not the popular thing, even though others aren't doing it. We've got to stand up for the integrity of who we are morally and spiritually, even if it costs us something, to do what is right when the time comes. So Haman sets up a plot. I'm going to kill Mordecai, that Jewish man, and I'm going to kill all the Jews with him. Well, as it turns out, Mordecai finds out all about it. And he immediately runs to Queen Esther. Says, "Queen, they're going to kill us. All of us. And don't think that they're going to be safe inside the palace there. They're going to kill all the Jews, okay? You've got to go talk to the king." She says, "I can't go talk to the king. If you step into the king's court and he hasn't called you in there first, you're dead. I can't do that." He says, "You've got to." So they set up the time, and she says, "Well, okay, maybe this has to happen." Chapter 4, verse 14, I think, is the key verse of it all. He looks at her and says, "And who knows but that you have come to this very position for such a time as this?" Could you imagine that God doesn't just have coincidences, but God has a plan and a purpose? No matter what's happening, he might have you in the perfect spot at the perfect time for the perfect thing for his kingdom. Remember a few weeks ago, I talked about a guy by the name of Joseph. Joseph didn't have a very good life, because he was well loved by his father, Jacob, but then he was sold off into slavery, and then slavery at Potiphar's house off in a foreign land in Egypt. He's there, and Potiphar's wife looks at him and says, "Yeah, he's a pretty good-looking guy. Maybe I'll be with him." And she tries to be with him, and he fights her off, says, "No, that's the wrong thing. I'm not going to do such a thing." She gets upset because he rejected her advances, so she said, "Oh, he tried to rape me." He gets thrown in prison. He's rotting in prison in some foreign nation going, "What did I ever do, God, to deserve this?" As it turns out, he interprets some dreams to a baker and a cupbearer for the king. And as it turns out, the king has a dream and says, "Oh my goodness, who's going to interpret this?" And they go, "Oh, I know somebody. He's rotting in prison right now. His name is Joseph." Joseph comes out, he interprets the dream. He not only saves Egypt from the great famine that comes, but he also saves Israel, who comes over and spends time in Egypt right there. And his brothers, they felt really bad. They said, "We're sorry we did that." He says, "Don't feel bad. You see, it's worked out perfectly in God's plan that I was supposed to be right here, right now, at this very time as this, to accomplish something." Some of you know some friends, Kevin and Kim Mills, that are over in Indonesia working as missionaries. And right now there's horrible flooding going on right where they are. People they know are being swept away down the mountains, okay? And they put in their newsletter this week, as I read it, it said, "We're here at such a time as this so that we can help in this time of need." They understood we're here right now. It's perfect timing, perfect place for God's perfect plan. And here we are. So the queen says this, "All right, we're going to make this thing happen. Pray for 3 days and fast. I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to go see the king, and I'm going to step into his presence." And here's what she says, "I will go to the king even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Sometimes, folks, you just got to be brave. Sometimes we just got to do what we're called to do. God says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Sometimes you just got to do what's right. You flat out got to do what's right. Well, back to Haman. Haman's really upset now. He's really frustrated at this guy named Mordecai. And so he decides that he's going to really finally come to the time to put Mordecai to death. Esther goes before the king. She says, I want to connect with you here. Here's what I want to do. I want to ask a request. He says, okay. She says, let's have a huge banquet tomorrow. I'll ask the request then. He says, okay. So the only ones at the banquet are Esther, the king, and Haman, the one who doesn't like them. Okay? They get there. They have their big time together. And he says, what's your request? She says, well, we're going to have another banquet tomorrow, and then I'll give you the request. Okay, that works. So Haman now is burning with anger because he sees this. Now, here's what I want you to see about Haman. It's just amazing how this whole story goes, of what he wants to do and how he wants to destroy him. He says, I have been elevated above all others. I have been honored by the king, elevated above everyone else. I have great wealth. I am the only one. You see, the queen and the king and I are the only ones celebrating at this great banquet. You see, I am up here. Everything in life is great. And he gets to one part, he says, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Can you imagine that? I mean, obsessed much? Got some anger issues there, buddy? You've got everything in the world. You're the second most powerful person in the whole kingdom. And that one person has gotten under your skin so much that you can't even be happy. Anybody ever met someone like that? I'm telling you, if that's where you are right now, if you have a person or a situation in your life that's gotten under your skin and you just can't stand it, can I just give you this word of advice? Let it go. Please, let it go. Because things don't work out so well here. So it just happens that night, and I don't believe in coincidences. It just happens that night that the king can't sleep. So he orders that the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be read to him. Maybe he'll fall asleep. And they just happen to read the part, are you ready for this, where Mordecai had exposed the big thing of the two people who were trying to kill and assassinate the king. And he read about that, and he says, whoa, my goodness. He says, what honor and recognition did we give Mordecai for doing that? And they said, nothing. We didn't do anything. He's like, oh, that's not good. Now, at the same time, Haman has been out and he's built a 75-foot gallows next to his house because he's going to hang Mordecai. And he's going to go to the king this very evening and say, I want to hang Mordecai tomorrow, okay? So he's there at the court, ready to say, I want to hang Mordecai. And first thing, the king comes out and says, wait, come here a minute. He says, what do you think should be done for the person that I truly want to honor? And he's thinking, oh, he's talking about me. He says, I would do this. I would get a robe that the king has worn before and put it on him. I'd get the horse that the king has rode and put him on that. And I would just take him all the way through the city and say, look at how honored this person is. Look at how great he is. He's thinking, this is all about me. And the king says, great idea. I want you to go do that for Mordecai. What? No way. See how God works it, that even your enemies honor you in the midst of this. He does not want this to happen, but he goes and he does it for Mordecai. And as he comes back, his family and friends are like, man, this guy's he's going to be the death of you. He's going to ruin you. The next day comes about, they have the banquet. They're all there. The king says, what's your request? And the queen, Esther, she says, somebody's trying to kill all the Jews, all my people. They're going to kill us all. I wouldn't even have bothered you if they just made us slaves, but they're going to kill us. And he gets enraged. He says, who would kill my queen and all of her people? And she goes, Haman. He's so angry. He leaves. Haman knows, I'm in trouble. Okay? So he begs and pleads, Esther, please save my life. And he's pleading so much and he's in such distress that he literally falls onto the couch where she's reclining. Right when the king comes back in, he says, it's not enough you want to kill my queen and all her people. You want to molest her right in front of me, right in here in my own court? Whoop. They put a hood upon him. And guess what? Boom. There's a sermon here that I'm not going to get to today, but he builds a 75-foot high gallows to try and kill the person that he hates so much, Guess who gets hung there? Yeah, Haman. Can I just say it this way? Folks, if you got anger, if you got bitterness, if you've got unforgiveness, if you've got pride, it leads to destruction of yourself, not the other person. Let it go. Please let it go. The king says, yep, go for it. You go, can just jump right in. You can defend yourselves, you Jewish people, which they weren't going to let anybody else do. If somebody tries to attack you, and a lot of people still did, Haman's family and others, they said, we're going to try and kill all the Jews. The Jews, they defended themselves, they protected themselves, and God gives them this incredible victory in the midst of all of this. This incredible victory. And if we remember what it said last week, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Remember, he spoke that to those who are sitting there in exile. And now listen to what the story is, what happens. Here's what it says. In the city of Susa held a joyous celebration, and the Jews, it was a great time of happiness and joy and honor. And there was joy and gladness among all of them, feasting and celebrating. And many people from other nationalities became Jews just because of all this great stuff that was taking place. God says, I got a plan, man. I know you're in exile, but look at the great stuff that's going to happen here. You're going to finally do what I've asked you to do, be a light to the nations, and that's going to happen, and then we're going to bring you back. This is a great thing, folks. And they celebrate, and even in exile, some great things take place. Guess who gets Haman's house? Mordecai, Esther. That's where they get to live now. God says, I got a plan. Doesn't look good right now, but I got a plan. And we're going to take care of you. Because sometimes, folks, you just got to be brave. Sometimes you just got to do what God asks you to do. And you know what? I truly believe that we need more Esthers and more Mordecais. We need more people who are willing to stand up and follow God and do what is right, even if it comes with a cost, to say, God, I'm going to do it. Wholeheartedly, I'm going to serve you and do everything I can. Would you be brave? I mean, here's 3 stories of people in their faithfulness were ready to give up their lives to do what was right. Could we not be those kinds of people? To say, no matter what it is, God, we are going to do it, and we're going to stand up for what's right. We're going to do what's right and make it happen. Or maybe you're at a point where you're beginning to see and understand that you're fitting into God's purpose and plan, and maybe perhaps it's for a time right as this, such as this, that you are going to accomplish something amazing in God's kingdom. And that we have to faithfully just be who we're called to be and do what we're called to do until that perfect time and that perfect place, and God lets that perfect thing happen through us. Maybe you're there. Maybe you're waiting for that time and you're being prepared for that perfect time and place. Be faithful. But wherever God is leading you, whatever God is saying, would we stand up and be brave and say, yes, God, we will go where you call us to go. Do what you call us to do and be who you call us to be.